Live from Washington, this is BBC News. Friedrich Merz is set to become the next Chancellor of Germany as exit polls suggest his centre-right grouping has won the election, while the far-right AfD makes historic gains. Volodymyr Zelensky says he's willing to give up his presidency if it will mean peace for Ukraine. And the Vatican says Pope Francis remains in a critical condition in hospital, but hasn't had any respiratory attacks since Saturday morning. Hello, I'm Ritika Gupta and welcome to the programme where we begin in Germany, where Conservative parties appear to have secured a decisive victory in snap elections. According to exit polls, Friedrich Merz of the centre-right Christian Democrats is poised to become Germany's next chancellor after the party secured 30% of the vote. But the far-right Alternative for Germany party, better known as AfD, came in second with a record 20%, boosting the EU's biggest economy, and immigration reforms were the top issues for voters following the collapse of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition. The three outgoing parties, including Scholz's ruling Social Democrats, were considered the biggest losers of Sunday's election, pointing to German voters' frustration with the incumbent government. But Merz now faces the challenge of forming a coalition government and has already discounted bringing in the AfD. Our Europe editor Katya Adler reports.
With a spring in his step, the man likely to be Germany's next chancellor, usually pretty dour in his demeanour, allowed himself a brief beam at the party faithful before getting down to serious business.
Dear
friends, the world outside won't wait for us. We need to get our domestic politics right. We need to be more present on the EU and the world stage. Germany will have a reliable government again.
Let's celebrate now, and the hard work begins tomorrow, is what he said. Friedrich Merz has dreamt all of his life of becoming Germany's next chancellor, but he knows the challenges at home and abroad are huge. Germany's economy is so big, it's such a key player in NATO and the EU that success or failure here impacts all of Europe.
Shame on you!
And Germany is divided. As Friedrich Merz was speaking inside party headquarters, these protesters outside tried to drown him out. While on the other side of Berlin, the hard-right AfD was smiling through gritted teeth. They wanted us to halve our support, but we doubled it, said the party leader. Since World War II, no far-right force has ever had this success in Germany. It'll be frozen out of government, though, considered too extreme by traditional parties here. The AfD says they're wrong. Even without the AfD, coalition building is a tricky business. Bargaining, bartering, even bickering is usual. But voters I met at this Berlin market today said politicians had no time to lose.
We need a new government fast. We are drowning in problems. Money, migration, defense.
I think we need to build a new government quickly because the world feels like a dangerous place right now.
Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Germans worry about the safety and future of their country and of Ukraine. Germany is the second largest donor of military aid to Kyiv after the US, but it's not sure it's ready to send boots on the ground there. Berlin's Brandenburg Gate is a military monument that's come to symbolize peace and unity, neither of which Germany or Europe have right now. This continent is scrambling to get its act together. Tonight's results point to stronger leadership from one of its biggest powers. Katya Adler, BBC News, Berlin.
President Zelensky has said that he'd be prepared to give up the presidency if it meant bringing peace to his country. It's as Ukraine approaches the somber third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. Here's a look at where territorial gains currently stand. You can see the regions in red there in Ukraine's east are controlled by Russia, while the purple shows areas that have been regained or held by Ukrainian forces. Overnight, Russia launched its largest drone attack yet, targeting at least 13 regions, including the capital, Kyiv. From there, the BBC's Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse sent this report.
In Kyiv, war fatigue has a different meaning than it does in Washington. A record 267 Russian drones were launched in one night. Most were shot down, but some always break Ukraine's stretched air defences, like here in Zaporizhia. This attack preceded a wartime fixture in the capital, President Zelensky's anniversary press conference. This year there was an elephant in the room, with Donald Trump siding with Moscow in claiming that he lacks legitimacy without an election. Ukraine's leader gave a surprising response.
If to achieve peace you really need me to give up my post, I am ready. I can trade it for NATO, if there are such conditions. I'm focused on Ukraine's security today, not in 20 years. I'm not going to be in power for decades.
The White House is demanding access to billions of dollars worth of Ukraine's natural minerals in exchange for the military aid it's provided to date and could in the future. Mr. Zelensky says America's help so far have been agreed as grants, not loans.
When the US sells weapons to Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, do they earn 100% interest? I just want a dialogue with President Trump. I'm not signing something that will be paid off by 10 generations of Ukrainians.
That was the most relaxed we've seen President Zelensky in this anniversary press conference. Clearly, he and Donald Trump have a relationship that is far from ideal, and you get the sense, outwardly at least, that he would not accept a mineral deal or ceasefire plan that he didn't think was in the interests of Ukraine, and that would have profound consequences for the course of this war. In Russia, the invasion's architect, Vladimir Putin, was honouring fallen soldiers on Defenders Day. Medals were also given to troops fighting in Ukraine. His new relationship with Washington has been described as promising by the Kremlin. At the moment, any peace deal looks set to favour him and not Kyiv. To mark the 3-year anniversary of an invasion Russia hoped would last 3 days, there have been demonstrations across Europe, from Prague to Paris. But leaders here are now working out how to provide security in a post-war Europe without America.
At a crucial juncture in the war, the United States is retracting support for Ukraine and showing apparent favour to longtime adversary Russia. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff on Sunday defended President Trump's approach to resolving the conflict.
I think that President Trump believes, and I believe because he believes it, that trust building begins with good, proper communication. And we just had a great discussion, me and President Putin, and now it will be up to President Putin and President Trump to work something out, and I think they're going to be successful.
And to discuss efforts to boost the eroding U.S. support for Kyiv under the Trump administration, I'm pleased to be joined now by Stephen Moore, founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project, and its Chief Operating Officer, Anna Shvetsova. It's an NGO that helps funnel aid to Ukraine and educate Republican policymakers about the conflict. So welcome, both of you. Stephen, I want to start off with you. Talk to me about your mission, coming at a time, of course, when Republicans are divided over the aid being sent to Ukraine. What kind of conversations are you having with conservative policymakers?
Well, you know, I was the chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives for about 7 years. Then I went to Ukraine on day 5 of the war to help. So I'm one of the few people in the world that's been to the Ukrainian front and to the floor of the House of Representatives. And, what we're hearing is that people in Congress are confused. No one likes Putin. Putin has a 9% approval rating in the United States. And so people are wondering what is the end game, what's happening here. And a lot of people are actually saying that this is an effort to get Zelensky to sign the mineral deal, and that when he does that, things will improve.
So do you think that the mineral deal will help with that respect?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things about that. One, that Trump wants it, and it's easier for Trump to sell to his voters that, hey, we got something for what we're doing. And 2, if there's American business interest in Ukraine, then America has to take an interest. America has to take notice.
And Stephen, you just mentioned there about the supporters of Trump, and a lot of Americans that voted Trump in, well, they support the America First policy. So is there a worry among conservatives that by continuing to send aid to Ukraine, that is going to alienate those supporters?
Yeah, aid to Ukraine is wildly unpopular among the Republican base. And a lot of that is because there's massive amounts of, this sounds so trite, Russian propaganda directed towards conservatives. But there is a lot of misinformation out there. And so one of the things we do is get good information to Republican policymakers so they can make better decisions.
And Anna, I want to bring you in here. Zelensky has said that he would step down as president in exchange for joining NATO. How do Ukrainians feel about that?
There are interesting things which are happening in Ukrainian society right now. So before President Trump became president, ratings of Zelensky was going down. However, when Trump started beating up on him, he started regaining his popularity among Ukrainians. It looks like what Trump didn't know about us is that, about Ukrainians, is that you can beat on Zelensky as much as you can, as long as you are Ukrainian. So we do not allow President Trump to beat on our president. And what we see is that Zelensky is showing great leadership now. And we are as united now as in February 2022.
And Anna, talk to me about your mission for minorities in Ukraine. Tell us more about that.
So Russians are persecuting and torturing Christians for their faith on the occupied territories. Baptists and evangelicals are targeted disproportionately because when Russian soldiers come to the occupied territories and they see a Baptist, a Presbyterian, they think of this person as of somebody who has American religion. And Russian priests are agents of the Kremlin because Russian church is not the church as you and me would think of it. So they think that this Baptist pastor is an agent of American government. So they torture him, they imprison him, sometimes they murder them. We know about around 60 pastors that were killed by now.
And Stephen, what do you make of the US approach to ending this war?
Yeah, well, I think that if there's, it seems kind of chaotic, right? But it's the first month of a White House, which is going to be chaotic, and Trump breeds chaos. That's the way he operates. But I think if there's one indisputably good thing to come out of this is that Europe needs to step up. The UK has been leading, but there's 3 countries in Europe: France, Belgium, and Spain, who have given more money to the Russians in the form of liquid natural gas purchases than they have aid to Ukraine. And one of them, Belgium, controls $250 billion in assets, frozen Russian assets, that could be used to help Ukraine. But it's 3 years into it, and not €1 has come out of that. So if there's one good thing, to all this chaos, Europe needs to step up. And we're in a global war. There's shooting wars in Europe and the Middle East. And if Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula light up, then the United States military is designed to work on 2 fronts. So that's 4 fronts. One of them needs to be taken on by Europe.
And are you finding it difficult to get support from the conservatives for Ukraine when you're having these conversations?
I'm old-fashioned. The truth works. You tell people the truth, they make good decisions. And so some of the things that there's 20,000 Ukrainian children that the Ukrainian government has identified that have been trafficked to Russia. And when you tell them about this, they're reminded that Vladimir Putin's evil, and if I was advising Trump, I would tell him, limit your exposure to Vladimir Putin. He's a bad guy and nobody likes him.
And Stephen, I want to get your thoughts here because you mentioned that Europe should step up when it comes to this conflict. But we are seeing that the UK is set to impose sanctions tomorrow, as well as the EU. But on the other hand, we're seeing the US and Trump almost cozying up to Russia in some ways. Is there a risk that they could actually remove sanctions, we're seeing actually maybe a divergence with Europe and the US. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think removing sanctions from Russia right now would be counterproductive. The Russian economy is on the rocks. We're seeing the sanctions. Biden finally put in the sanctions that he needed to put in 25 days before he left office. So it's time to let those sanctions do some work, and I think it would be premature to let up on Putin before you get something out of it.
And Anna, very, very quickly, because we don't have much time, but any message that you have, of course, ahead of this anniversary?
We see America as our partner in this war. It's our ally, and we see Russia as our mutual long-time adversary. And we expect, we hope that Trump, in spite of, he might be saying the wrong things, the things that we do not like, but we expect him to make the right steps.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, Stephen Moore there and Anna Shvetsova of the Ukrainian Freedom Project. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's look at some other stories making news. A body has been found in the search for a runner who disappeared in County Durham 5 days ago. 23-year-old Jenny Hall was last seen leaving her home on Tuesday. Durham Constabulary said the body was found in a very remote area of Teesdale, and there are not thought to be any suspicious circumstances. A 16-year-old boy has been arrested after a teenager was stabbed at a Primark store in Nottingham on Sunday morning. The 17-year-old victim is in hospital with serious injuries after being stabbed in the chest. Police believe there was an altercation between a group of young people outside the store before the stabbing happened. And police are continuing to search for a driver who fled the scene after a 3-year-old girl was killed in a crash between a van and a tram in Manchester city centre. Officers are understood to know who the offender is and are actively looking to bring him into custody. After colliding with the tram, the van ended up on the pavement where it hit the girl. You're live with BBC News. More now on Ukraine, and European leaders are stepping up their support for Kyiv as the US continues to distance itself. Among a flurry of calls to allies on Sunday, British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer spoke with French President Emmanuel Macron about meeting Ukraine's security needs. Both leaders are heading to Washington this week for separate talks with President Trump. And on Monday, the UK and EU are expected to announce a fresh round of sanctions against Russia for its aggression in Ukraine. And joining me live now is Daniel Tannenbaum. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and partner at Oliver Wyman's Risk and Public Policy Practice, where he leads the global anti-financial crime practice. So, Dan, welcome to the show. The UK, we know, is going to announce new sanctions against Russia on Monday, and it's said to be the largest since the early days of the war, and the EU will also be doing the same. So what do you think that these sanctions will look like?
So, Ritika, I think there's a few more levers that can be pulled on further bans on trade with Russia on additional sectors that have been allowed to continue. We've seen aluminum, as for one instance, as one commodity that certainly Europe has been focused on. I think the real question is what the U.S. does in parallel, since we've had 3 years of a really joined up alliance that obviously is frayed since Munich a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, and picking up on that point about what the US is going to do, because while we're seeing the UK and the EU set to impose more sanctions, the US teams are reportedly planning another meeting this week with the Russian team. So do you think that the US may actually lift sanctions on Russia?
So I don't think the U.S. is going to lift sanctions on Russia. And I think the one benefit that Ukraine has in this mixed messaging coming out of the U.S. is you had the Treasury Secretary, you had General Kellogg take the train to and from Kyiv last week, which is a 24-hour round trip journey that does change people's perspective once they're on the ground. The other thing to note is that President Biden, in addition to raising those sanctions that Stephen Moore noted came 25 days before the end of his term, recodified them in a way that President Trump or any president has to notify Congress of their potential lifting. And all of the messaging out of Congress even on the Republican side, is this would be very unpopular to preemptively lift sanctions on Russia.
But we're still seeing this big divide, even if they don't remove the sanctions, even in just rhetoric when it comes to the US and the Europe and where they stand on this war.
Well, I think certainly we've all been accustomed or reaccustomed to the rhetoric out of the administration over the last month. When you look at the Senate Republican leadership, when you look at members of President Trump's administration, there is certainly a divide. I mean, it is important to note all of the noise around this mineral deal that actually began during the Biden administration. It was the Ukraine government that slow rolled it to have an early deal with Trump early on, which now has proven to be a bit more complicated. But I do think ultimately there is a pretty strong view within the Republicans in Congress that Russia is bad. They are clearly the aggressor, and hopefully that will influence the administration over time.
And Dan, what about these calls for using frozen Russian assets to support reconstruction of Ukraine? Can you discuss that in a bit more detail for us?
So this was a red line for policymakers in the Biden administration, and a plan was hatched to essentially take the interest earned, the proceeds earned from those frozen assets across Europe and around the world, and use those to help support Russia, which is not nearly the $300 billion in immobilized sovereign assets. I do think you're going to hear more discussions across Europe to tap into those assets. It is something I imagine the U.S. administration will be against. But bluntly, the bulk of the assets sit in Belgium. They do not sit in the United States.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Dan Tannenbaum at Oliver Wyman for joining us and sharing your insights. Now, the already fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas appears to be in jeopardy. Just hours ago, Hamas said it will not continue negotiations with Israel unless hundreds of Palestinian prisoners are released, as initially agreed between both parties in the long-awaited peace deal. In a move supported by the White House, Israel said it was delaying the prisoner release until the next release of Israeli hostages was secured. Israel now says its army will step up operational readiness around Gaza in possible preparation to resume fighting against Hamas. Meanwhile, Israeli tanks have been deployed in the occupied West Bank for the first time in 2 decades. Residents in 3 refugee camps have been expelled from the area, with the Defense Minister Israel Katz saying the Israeli army will occupy the territory for a year. And let's take a look at some other headlines now. The Italian Air Force escorted on an American Airlines plane after what the airline called a security concern. Flight 292 from New York to New Delhi then made an emergency landing in Rome. The airline later said the threat proved non-credible. Thousands of workers at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, are expected to be fired or placed on leave at midnight. It comes after a federal judge rejected a lawsuit from unions against what they call the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle the agency. Separately, federal workers at several U.S. departments face a Monday deadline to complete a survey about their productivity or risk being fired. And a British couple in their 70s has been arrested by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Peter and Barbie Reynolds have been running training projects in Afghanistan for 18 years. Their daughter told the BBC she's not heard from them in more than 2 weeks. Our correspondent Francis Reid has more.
So Peter and Barbie Reynolds were detained while returning to their home around 100 miles west of Kabul. That's where they were basing themselves. And apparently they'd been detained when returning back to the house that they live in a mountainous area there. The couple has a very long-standing relationship with Afghanistan and in the country itself. They've been running training projects within Afghanistan for almost 2 decades now. So in schools and also with women and children and women and girls. Peter and Barbie had based themselves in the mountainous area of Bamiyan, and when the Taliban returned to power in 2021, most Westerners left the country, but the couple decided to stay in Afghanistan. They insisted on staying, in fact. Their daughter told the Sunday Times that they were just trying to help the country they loved and that they were meticulous about sticking to the country's rules, even as they were changing quite quickly when the Taliban came back into power. So according to the PA news agency, the couple were arrested alongside their American friend as well as a translator at the time that they were detained. Taliban sources confirmed that British nationals had been arrested around 20 days ago.
The Vatican says Pope Francis remains in a critical health condition but has not presented any further respiratory issues since Saturday, when he needed oxygen and blood transfusions. A prognosis has yet to be given. The Vatican said the Holy Father participated in the Holy Mass earlier today and is alert, but a source told the AFP news agency that he hasn't eaten breakfast or read the newspapers, unlike earlier in the week. And take a look at these live pictures from the Vatican. The Pope has been in the Gemelli Hospital in Rome for over a week now. Earlier on Sunday, the Vatican issued a written address from the Pope. In it, the 88-year-old said that the large-scale war against Ukraine is a painful and shameful occasion for all humanity. He also thanked his doctors and well-wishers for their messages and called on Roman Catholics to pray for peace in other global conflicts. And you can keep up to date with that story and others on the website bbc.com/news or the app. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching us and stay with us here on BBC News. Goodbye.